We will begin in 60 seconds.
Tai timu, tai pari, tai hoa e haere. I te hoki ngā atu o te ngaru, ka kete atu au e kua riro atu koutou. Nō reira kai ngā rangatira, nā matariki kua riro atu ki te pō. Haere, haere, oti atu rā. Karakia te matanga tēnei. Tūtawa mai runga, tūtawa mai raro, tūtawa mai roto, tūtawa mai waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora ki a tātou katoa, haumi e, hui e, tāi e. Ana ko tō tātou waiata ko te aroha. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari tātou e ano. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari tātou e. Ka te kia ora mai anō tātou, rārau mai ki tēnei hui hui rangatira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo. Rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Paula Tesarero tōku ingoa, ko o te kai hutu, tika hauatanga mō te kāhui, tika tangata ki Aotearoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mihi ki a koe mātua Hemi for setting the pathway for this morning's session with the independent monitoring mechanism, where we are undertaking our session on accessibility and independence. I'm Paula Tesarero, the Disability Rights Commissioner, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this morning's session. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome everybody. Welcome to all of the government officials who are here for the fourth day now answering questions from the independent monitoring mechanism. Thank you for being here, and thank you, Brian, for your leadership, and Julia Bergman today, who I understand will be leading, coordinating the government's responses to our questions. This is session 7 of an exercise where the members of the Independent Monitoring Mechanism, which is the Human Rights Commission, the Disabled People's Organisations Coalition, and the Office of the Ombudsman, are asking the New Zealand government questions about its compliance with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. How this morning will work is a member of the IMM will ask the government a question, and the government will provide a response. We won't have a lot of interaction in this first part of the session, though as the chair, if I need to ask any clarifying questions, I will take the opportunity to do so. We then move into part 2, where everybody takes a break except for the IEMM, who will deliberate on the responses that we have received from government and develop supplementary questions. To everybody listening today, I warmly welcome you on behalf of all of us. There'll be disabled people listening, tangata whaikaha Māori and whānau hoa, members of the public, families and whānau who will be listening. I encourage people to take the opportunity to put questions into Slido. The instructions for Slido will be in the same instructions that you have to access this public forum. Please take the time to ask questions, and we encourage you to do that in the first part of the session. That way, when we move to part 2, we will have the questions in Slido that we can consider asking government. We won't get to all of the questions in Slido, but we'll do our best to cover a number of them, and those that we can't address today, we'll follow up with the government at a later date. Following part 2, we come back for part 3 at 11 o'clock, where we will ask the government a series of supplementary questions and receive responses to that. So, ngā mihi nui, kia koutou katoa. Thank you again for joining us. Can I just ask, when government responds to questions, that you look directly at the camera as much as you can, and that you say your name and the agency that you are from, so that people listening can get a sense of who's talking and where you're from. Without further ado, I'm going to pass to my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Godfrey from the Association of Blind Citizens of New Zealand, to make an opening statement. Kia ora, Jonathan.
Thank you, Paula. New Zealand has ratified the Disability Convention, and disabled New Zealanders are expecting implementation to make their rights real. Governments must keep working towards progressive realisation to make it possible for disabled people to live independently and participate in their communities. This means government has an obligation to ensure all systems and structures, such as public buildings, roads, transport, the education and judicial systems, schools and hospitals, and all government services and their websites and information must be accessible to disabled people. The following 3 quotes are indicative of what disabled people have to say about accessibility and independence. First, from a survey respondent. My primary concern is about accessibility of information. I need alerts about changes in the neighbourhood. When the council digs up our footpaths, they put handwritten notes in our letterbox, which rarely get read. Some neighbours do alert us, but in fairness, they all lead busy lives. Then, from a Hui participant, digital inclusion often excludes people unable or unwilling to use technology. And from another Hui participant, it's difficult getting accessible information. Disabled people need to become visible in our country. The IMM does recognise there is some progress, such as the Accessibility Charter, which requires government agencies to commit to ensuring accessibility of their websites, information, and services. There is increased awareness of the informational needs of disabled people and recognition of their right to have information in a format such as New Zealand Sign Language, Easy Read, Braille, audio, or large print. Government's awareness and recognition is a contributing factor to there being a significant increase in the amount of information available in alternate formats. The decision to implement accessibility legislation is an example of government taking positive steps. Disabled people are optimistic about the establishment of the Ministry for Disabled People and the rollout of system transformation across the country. Disabled people look forward to seeing how these initiatives will work in practice and what outcomes will be achieved. The independent monitoring mechanism expects positive ongoing progress to ensure accessibility and independence through. First bullet point, better resourcing of government to meet the needs of disabled people, thereby ensuring equity is a business as usual activity. Second bullet point, ongoing engagement with disabled people through their representative organisations, as set out in Article 4.3 and General Comment 7, to inform all elements of work and to understand what is required. The third bullet point, the co-design of new systems and structures with disabled people. The fourth bullet point is government collecting and analysing data and evidence to prove that it is closing the equity gaps that exist for disabled people. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui, Jonathan. It's Paula speaking. We're going to move straight into our questions of the government, and I'm going to hand back to Jonathan Godfrey from the Association of Blind Citizens of New Zealand to ask the first question. Please, Jonathan.
Thank you. Question 1 asks, given the government has noted the introduction of access legislation in the coming months as a key strategic initiative that will improve accessibility and independence of disabled people in New Zealand, the independent monitoring mechanism asks, what guarantees the government believes this initiative will create for the people it hopes to serve? In particular, in what ways will disabled people determine the priorities and definitions of accessibility in line with General Comment 2 of the UN CRPD?
Thanks, Jonathan. Can I turn in the first instance to you, Julia, and to determine how the government will respond? Over to you.
Yeah, kia ora Paula. Ko Julia Bergman Takuingoa. I'm the General Manager of Disability, Seniors and International Policy at the MSD. Paula, can I just check with you as the Chair, would you like me to introduce the other government officials here today, or would you like us to do that question by question?
Just people who speak in response to each question. Thanks, Julia.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. So I'll respond to your first question, Jonathan. We acknowledge there are varying definitions of accessibility, and it means different things to different people, depending on their sector and their personal experience. What is common across all definitions is the prevention and removal of barriers, designing products, services, devices, and environments in a way they can be independently reached, entered, or used, easy to obtain or use, and easily understood by all people. This understanding is in line with the UN CRPD expectations as seen in Article 9. What is common, my apologies. This is why the government has agreed that the framework set accessibility as a high-level concept rather than a detailed prescriptive definition. To ensure disabled people, tangata whaikaha Māori and whānau whaikaha are involved in decision-making on accessibility, Cabinet has agreed to establish a new function, at the moment known as the Accessibility Governance Board, to provide direct, independent advice to both the Minister for Disability Issues and the relevant Chief Executive on what and how accessibility barriers should be addressed. In doing so, Cabinet has recognised that the board will need to be led by and represent disabled people, as well as bring in the technical expertise of government policy and business. To ensure the views and concerns of the disability community are considered in its advice, the board will be expected to engage extensively with disabled people and their whānau in all their diversities. Existing voice mechanisms and potentially new ones will be utilised to enable ongoing dialogue. Cabinet has also recognised that a high level of support for the board's work will be needed across government. As a result, Cabinet has agreed that the Minister for Disability Issues oversee the framework supported by a Chief Executive, and a secretariat will be established to support the board. As the framework is further implemented, further channels may be established to enable disabled people, tangata whaikaha and whānau whaikaha Māori and others with accessibility needs to inform the board of the accessibility barriers that they face. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. It's Paula speaking. Are you proposing anyone add to that, Julia, or is that's the main substantive answer?
That's a substantive answer to question 1. Thank you, Paula.
Thanks, Julia. I'm now going to hand back to Jonathan Godfrey from the Association of Blind Citizens of New Zealand for the second question. Please, Jonathan.
Question 2 asks, how will explicit minimum standards of accessibility be identified?
Thank you, Jonathan. Sorry, Paula.
No, please go ahead.
Thank you, Paula. So the government considered several options for how accessibility can be improved in New Zealand. We acknowledge that many people consider the accessibility framework should be more regulations focused, similar to existing legislation in the UK and Canada. However, Cabinet considered a regulation-focused regime to be too inflexible, challenging and resource-intensive to implement in the New Zealand context. Developing, implementing and designing standards is complex and requires significant time, funding and resources to create, and there is a risk of them being out of date by the time they are created. However, while accessibility regulations won't be the answer to all situations, they can be the solution to some barriers, particularly in domains that lend themselves to technical detail and prescription, or where such standards already exist. While the government has chosen a flexible approach, Minister Sepuloni has requested that the legislation be regularly reviewed to ensure we are making the desired progress towards an accessible New Zealand. Thank you.
Julia, it's Paula speaking. Just for clarification for listeners, are you able to talk about who will be identifying those minimum standards of accessibility?
So I can't talk in great detail on this, Paula, but I'm referring to the board that has been publicly announced that will be established as part of this framework.
Okay. Thanks for that, Julia. I'm going to move on to question 3, which is also back to Jonathan Godfrey. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thanks. How can the legislative proposal ensure its system will reduce or remove the need for disabled people to take complaints through processes covered by the Human Rights Act 1993?
Thank you, Jonathan. Julia Bergman speaking again. The complaints process under the Human Rights Act is based on mediation as the preferred approach to achieve individual solutions. While most complainants are satisfied with the outcome, mediated cases are subject to confidentiality, so do not generate publicity, and unless appealed higher, do not create precedents. Sanctions are limited to individual compensation, and there is no ability to make preventative or corrective orders. The nature of the complaints process under the Human Rights Act therefore limits its ability to facilitate systemic improvements over time, as well as its educative and deterrent effect. The accessibility framework will sit alongside the Human Rights Act 1993, but unlike that act, which focuses on resolving individual instances of discrimination, focus will be placed on addressing systemic accessibility barriers. The accessibility system and the progressive removal of systemic accessibility barriers over time should in turn reduce these instances of individual discrimination and therefore reduce the need for disabled people to take individual complaints through the Human Rights Act. Individual circumstances will still need to be considered in specific instances and accommodations provided in line with the Human Rights Act as appropriate. Thank you.
It's Paula speaking. Thank you for that, Julia. Just a question of clarification. Is it proposed as part of implementing whatever the final shape of the legislation is, that will be monitored? So what I mean by that is knowing that over time, the number of complaints through other mechanisms have reduced. Will that be part of what will be monitored in time?
There will definitely be a monitoring and evaluation aspect of the framework. I can't talk to details of what that will monitor and evaluate, but that will be core to this framework.
Okay, thanks, Julia. It's Paula speaking. We're going to move on to question 4. There are 3 parts to question 4, and I'm going to turn to Ronnie Sione from People First New Zealand, Ngā Tangata Tuatahi. Kia ora, Ronnie.
Hi. These questions are about Article 19, living independently and being included in the community. 1, what measures are in place to make sure A, disabled people will not be forced to live in a residential service, including disabled people under 65 living in rest home. B, and that there will be full range of living up options that are adaptable, available, accessible in the community, so that disabled people can exercise choice and control over their lives. C, what is the time frame to achieve these measures?
Ngā mihi, Ronnie. Can I turn to you, Julia, please, in the first instance?
Kia ora, Paula, thank you for that. It's Julia speaking. So I will introduce Erin Black from the Ministry of Health, with support from Claudia Boyles from Oranga Tamariki, to take the lead on responding to this question. So I will invite Erin to speak first.
O tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui, Ronnie mō tō pātai tēnei wā. Thank you for your question today, Ronnie. I'm going to start with a short statement in response to IMM's opening statement. I'll then address question 4, then hand over to Oranga Tamariki to address question 4. We're committed to address the system transformation now and in future years, all aspects of this theme alongside our partners. This will be within a tripartite arrangement as we move forwards towards the new Ministry for Disabled People. We have achieved some great successes and outlined a number of key points in learning based on evidence from Mid-Central. There are trends, but clearly we have a lot to do to address across the motu the disparity that remains for disabled people. I will respond to question 4 now. The Ministry previously introduced choices in community living and has recently expanded the availability of supported living to reduce reliance on residential care. Increased flexibility within IF services to allow payments to family members and open support provision in line with purchasing guidelines. How we expect to grow on those steps. Person-directed support arrangements require more development work with providers to make them simpler to access through, for example, making upfront costing of the arrangements simpler and easier to use. We would expect to expand these kinds of options through the roll-in of the transformed system. The specific timing of this is dependent on government budget decisions. In addressing broader policy system limits, some of the barriers that disabled people encounter in leaving residential care or that may result in them going in the first place include policy challenges around additional funding for living and transportation costs being available in residential care, but not in other services. It is common for the Ministry to fund above the contribution of the social security system the living costs of disabled people to be able to live in warm, dry housing and safe neighbourhoods, and to achieve access to higher standards of material well-being, including more regularly, more expensive foods in their diet. Likewise, whilst DSS does not generally fund transportation for disabled people, residential houses are usually funded to include access to a van or other transport. Whilst not strictly the same as being forced into residential care, hidden living and transport cost subsidies are being present in some services, but not in others, will create some inequity and create incentives for people to enter or remain in 24/7 care models, even when that is inappropriate. The impact of these subsidies appears to be particularly real in the context of rising housing costs in New Zealand. In transforming the system, there will be an opportunity to review contributions to living and transportation costs and come to a more principled rather than service-driven approach. Whilst this work has been identified as necessary as part of fully transforming the system, the specific timeframes for undertaking this policy work will need to be set by the new Ministry for Disabled People as part of prioritising the range of calls that will be upon it. We can point to workforce development improvements through the system transformation and also our approaches to improving the capability and capacity of disabled people, whānau and the Crown as examples, including disabled people under 65 living in rest homes. Like many jurisdictions, New Zealand has struggled to ensure that rest homes and hospital level care primarily for older persons is not drawn on to support under 65 disabled people. We have work underway to shift our reliance on aged residential care, or ARC, particularly those that provide hospital level care upon hospital discharge, particularly for people with higher medical needs. As our current utilisation of ARC facilities for under 65 disabled people is in part due to an ongoing lack of capacity in the non-ARC setting, any reduction in the utilisation of ARC will be dependent upon increasing appropriate non-ARC residential and non-residential capacity. We expect the model in the future to include transitional options with short lead in times focused on rehabilitation or community reintegration to support people to progress to more authentic living arrangements, which, based as they need to be on strong relationships, require longer lead times to establish. In response to part B of this question, through the roll-in of increased flexibility, the Ministry wants to improve practice around creating authentic living arrangements, ones in which the roles are real, that include the full rights and responsibilities that come with those roles, that are based on like-mindedness rather than like disability status. To achieve this, we need to accompany the introduction of flexibility with stimulating community conversation about how it can best be used. Because these options must be person-directed, it is risky to specify here any particular models, but we would expect to draw on the best of what we have seen from overseas for people to react to or reiterate on. We would expect that as a result of this work, we would see the range of living situations that disabled people have access to reflect the range of ways that contemporary New Zealanders live their lives, or ordinary life outcomes, as we like to call them in EGL. Again, this work is pinned to the roll-in of the system transformation and is contingent on government budget decisions. In response to part C of this question, while this work has been identified as necessary as part of fully transforming the system, the specific timeframes for undertaking this policy work will need to be set by the new Ministry of Disabled People as part of prioritising the range of calls that will be upon it. I'd like to hand over to Claudia Boyles from Oranga Tamariki for the opportunity to comment. Kia ora, Claudia.
Aaron. My name is Claudia Boyles. I'm the Chief Advisor Disability at Oranga Tamariki. And I just want to add to the response to this question in 3 different ways or 3 different fronts. The first is about care and the underlying principles that we have for community-based residential care. The second is about legislative amendments that we're about to embark on. And the third is about advocacy. So in terms of Tamariki and Rangatahi in community-based residential care, we're responsible for out-of-home care only when Tamariki and Rangatahi are in the care or custody of the Chief Executive. We have continuum of care responses to provide specific support to Tamariki and whānau. Our priority is for Tamariki to remain at home. When they cannot remain at home, we look to whānau, hapu and iwi, and then provide the most whānau-like setting that's available. There are a small group of Tamariki who receive support outside of a family-like setting, where the type and level of support is currently only available outside of whānau-like settings. We have a property team that assist us to access homes in the community for our Tamariki where it's needed. The team works closely with Kāinga Ora to acquire appropriate homes. In terms of legislative amendments, work is underway to amend the Oranga Tamariki Act and the legislative framework that applies to youth justice and care and protection residential placement settings. A number of changes are needed, including enabling the transition from institutional care settings to smaller, more therapeutic settings with a greater flexibility to meet the needs of the Tamariki and Rangatahi in out-of-home care. An area of focus is the regulation of residential care, in particular around the powers relating to the use of force, searches, detainment, seclusion, and secure care. The legislative amendment will be underpinned by the well-being and best interests of the Tamariki and reflect the wider shifts in the Oranga Tamariki practice towards therapeutic care that is trauma responsive and reflects Te Ao Māori principles for all Tamariki and Rangatahi, including those with complex needs and disabilities. Evidence shows that the use of seclusion can be significantly reduced and even eliminated through programs that address staff management and training in alternative methods of behavioural management for challenging behaviours with young people. We're looking to commence engagement, including with disabled people, regarding these potential legislative changes in the next few months. In terms of advocacy and support for tangata whaikaha, we have worked with Voice Whakaronga Mai to establish a tangata whaikaha service. This provides advocacy for Tamariki whaikaha with communication impairments and requiring specialist support to be able to express their views and have voice. The tangata whaikaha service uses specialist communication supports and non-instructive advocacy to ensure Tamariki voice and participation in care and protection and youth justice processes. As this initiative grows, Tamariki whaikaha will be able to join the Youth Council hosted by Voice Whakaronga Mai and be part of the co-design processes. We have 9 regional disability advisors who can assist social workers to provide advice to support disabled Tamariki and Rangatahi. And this includes taking into consideration as part of the child's assessment and the experience of whānau Māori living with disability, and ensuring that disabled Tamariki have the same rights as all Tamariki. Our regional disability advisors also work alongside disability organisations and services to meet the needs of disabled Tamariki and have provided training whenever that's requested. Thank you. Thanks, Erin.
It's Paula speaking. Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Claudia. I do have a couple of clarifying questions. One is just a general reminder if we can avoid using too many acronyms. We had a reminder in Slido yesterday and on social media from people listening, and I think the one which was used today was ARC, which is I think, but I'll turn to you, Erin. I think it's aged residential care.
Thanks, Paula. That's right, aged residential care. Apologies.
No, that's okay. It's very common. It's just a useful time to remind people to avoid using acronyms where possible, so that people listening know what is being talked about. The second clarifying question is for you, Claudia, tēnā koe. Thank you for that answer. I know that Oranga Tamariki have done quite a bit of work in recent years around gathering greater data and evidence about those, both in youth justice facilities and care and protection residences. Do you have a number that you can identify in terms of the number of disabled children in the care of Oranga Tamariki?
The short answer is no. I wish that we did, but the only number that we are confident about is that it's about 10% of the children in care, and that's based on children who have a diagnosis and receive disability support services. What that doesn't count is children who don't have a diagnosis, or children who are supported by ACC, for example, or children who are in the process of receiving a diagnosis. So no, I don't have an accurate number. Sorry.
Thanks, Claudia. Presumably then, if it's only those receiving disability support services, it also does not include those with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
That's right, unless they meet the criteria.
Okay, and just to further clarify, sorry, that was for kids in care. So does that figure exclude those in youth justice facilities?
No, that includes children.
Oh, includes both. Okay, okay. Thank you for that, Claudia. And thank you, Erin, for that comprehensive answer. There was a lot in there, and I'm sure we'll have some supplementary questions following that answer. I'm going to turn now to question 5, which is also in 3 parts, and I'm going to turn to Chris Roguski from People First New Zealand Ngā Tangata Tuatahi. Kia ora, Chris.
Kia ora, everyone. What measures, including gathering data and evidence, will be put into place? A, make sure all disabled people will benefit from the Enabling Good Lives rollout and system transformation, and it will leave no one behind. B, make sure all changes are in line with Article 19 and General Comment 5. C, what is the time frame to achieve the above measures?
Ngā mihi, Chris. It's Paula speaking. Julia, can I hand to you, please?
Kia ora, Paula. Julia speaking. I will again invite Erin Black from the Ministry of Health to respond to this question.
Well, kia ora, Julia. Ngā mihi, Chris. Thank you for your question. There is now good evidence that Enabling Good Lives can support and work for disabled people in all situations, not just as sometimes claimed those with the highest capability. This evidence has been gathered from the Waikato and Christchurch demonstrations and the Mid-Central prototype. In the most recent repeat survey of Mid-Central people, there were 17 significant positive critical shifts compared to 2018 in terms of experience of system, community connections, improved flexibility of funding, and greater sense of authority, control, and well-being. A system transformation will not be the panacea to all of the challenges noted in General Comment 5, but there are a number of things that can and will be done to try and ensure that all disabled people can enjoy their Article 19 rights. For populations the system has under-supported, data and evidence gained through the Mid-Central prototype enables us to forecast with greater confidence the likely increased uptake from children and young families who have previously found the system inaccessible or unuseful. It allows for us to forecast with greater confidence likely uptake from people including Māori and Pacifica who have historically been underrepresented. We're using this data as part of ensuring that there is appropriate resource to support these populations as they increasingly come into the system. A monitoring, evaluation and analysis and learning strategy has been co-developed with community within a tripartite governance structure. This not only builds on past evidence, but seeks to ensure all future evidence recognises and utilises community assets and expertise in the evaluation and monitoring context. 4 strategic shifts provide direction for all activities in the monitoring and evaluation space to work collaboratively with the Crown as system stewards. Data and evidence will aim to provide learning and insights that include qualitative and quantitative measurement based on an agreed outcomes framework. Experts from the community are developing alongside the Crown a comprehensive strategy and an indicative plan for action based on the 4 strategic shifts. This mahi is governed by disabled people, Māori and the Crown, and the strategy is due June the 20th to hand over to the new Ministry for Disabled People. MOH is leading a piece of work to ensure improved access to the health system by integration of disability access information and the National Health Indicator. This is also being negotiated alongside the data evidence and monitoring group led by disabled people with officials. Social support schemes enabling independent living included in the design of the Transform system is seamless support across government. Our experience in the Mid-Central prototype is that the ability to source funding behind the scenes from the appropriate government source has had a meaningful impact on the ease of which disabled people access support and the emotional, intellectual and time resource they can direct to creating and sustaining independent living situations. For disabled people whose decision-making is not always recognised, we expect the roll-in of personal budgets and other changes in support to include a heightened expectation of supported decision-making, where legal decision-making authority is not by choice or cannot be held currently under law, New Zealand law, by the disabled person. We will be setting policy and contractual expectations that those who do exercise that authority do so in line with the disabled person's will and preference for how they wish to live their life and be supported. Recognising the responsibility to disability in the person's own cultural context, we expect the Transform system to be culturally grounded in understanding the experiences of disabled people that people come forward with, including experiences navigating different cultural contexts and the additional challenges this can create for Māori and Pacifica. The way the system responds to those experiences, both in empowering decision-making processes and in the delivery of supports. Ngā mihi, thank you.
Ngā mihi, Erin. It's Paula speaking. Thank you for that comprehensive response. Are you just able to clarify for people listening that it was a comprehensive and very useful response? Thank you. Just the last part about the time frames. Can you just go over that? I think it was in line with handing to the new Ministry for Disabled People, but could you just clarify?
That's right, Paula. So on June 1st, the new Ministry for Disabled People will be established. At the moment, the work for the System Transformation Programme tasked with the national scaling of EGL will be working towards a smooth and successful setup of the new Ministry for Disabled People. So the timeline for us and the program at the moment is very much becoming in sync with the establishment of the new ministry.
Thanks, Erin. I think you said 1st June, but I think it's 1st July.
Apologies, it is 1st July.
Yes. No problem. Thank you for that, Erin. Okay, I'm now going to move on to question 6, And I'm going to turn to my colleague from the IMM, Anton Salmons from Deaf Aotearoa. Kia ora, Anton.
Hi everyone. Question 6. What concrete measures, including gathering data and evidence, is the government taking to make sure that NZSL New Zealand Sign Language is available to all disabled people as and when they need it for all aspects of life, including educational and cultural activities? What resources will the government provide to ensure rapid scaling up of these measures? And what are the milestones and also the timeframes to achieve them? Thank you.
Paula speaking. Julia, can I hand to you, please? Thanks, Anton.
Kia ora, Paula. Julia speaking. I'm going to invite my colleagues Shona Jones and Brian Coffey from the Office for Disability Issues to respond to this question.
Kia ora everyone, I'm Shona Jones from the Office for Disability Issues. I'm the manager of the NZSL team. And in just answering this question, just wanting to place it in a context that the response will be based on work that is governed by the New Zealand Sign Language Board, and the work is achieved alongside community groups with community leadership where possible. So the New Zealand Sign Language Board was set up in 2015. It's a ministerial advisory group appointed by Cabinet. The board has responsibility for leadership, monitoring and advice, and also coordinating groups across the deaf community and within the deaf sector. The board choose strategic work based on the New Zealand Sign Language Strategy. The New Zealand Sign Language Strategy was released in 2018, and it is based on 5 language planning principles. Those principles are acquisition, so the learning of NZSL, the use and access, how people can use New Zealand Sign Language in New Zealand, attitude, what are people's attitudes towards New Zealand Sign Language in New Zealand, the documentation of the language, and the status. So how is NZSL recognised in law? All of these language planning areas are critical because NZSL is an official language of New Zealand, but it's also a threatened language. So there are fewer people using the language now than ever before. In terms of data and evidence and tracking the work of the strategy, we have begun to develop measures and gather some baseline information so that we can track progress over time. The type of information that we're gathering is how deaf NZSL users access public services, possibly through the use of NZSL interpreters, looking to see how many people are learning New Zealand Sign Language, whether in a school setting, but also adult education, community education. And in June this year, we'll be releasing a community survey so we can understand from the community what their views are, how satisfied they are about how NZSL is viewed and used in New Zealand. The board achieve their work program through an annual fund. And this annual fund was actually increased in 2019, where between 2015 and 2019, most of the work was achieved through providing community grants. So local community organisations could identify work that they believe would maintain and promote New Zealand Sign Language in New Zealand. They could apply and receive a grant. But in 2019, it was recognised that to make sure that the strategy was achieved, there was going to need to be some key strategic work that was funded. And that's things like making sure that there's really good documentation of the language in the online NZSL dictionary. So examples like that. But a large part of what the board does is based on NZSL community grants. And since 2015, we've had 9 different community grant rounds, and there have been a range of activities that different groups and organisations have achieved through the NZSL community grants. For things like deaf clubs and community groups, there have been numerous family camps to promote the use of NZSL for deaf children, supporting deaf clubs as the home of New Zealand Sign Language, I suppose, a deaf space where the language is celebrated. Also work to make sure that the deaf community itself is inclusive of other disabilities, and things like sports events and things. There have been a lot of resources developed. Learn NZSL is a new resource that you can go and learn NZSL online. Lots of performing arts. So the Waikato University have developed a lot of plays that they've toured nationally. Te Papa has developed NZSL resources, so that's accessible in NZSL. And also a number of work to support NZSL interpreting in different settings, so in mental health settings and pharmacy settings, for example. So that's the range of community grant work that's gone on, but I'll also speak to some of the strategic work that is being directed by the board. So when we think about acquisition, one of the 5-year goals for the board is that deaf children have access to NZSL. They can learn New Zealand Sign Language at the same rate as their peers would learn other languages. So the board are funding assessments for adult users of NZSL with a particular focus on professionals working in deaf education, so that deaf children in schools have access to fluent models of New Zealand Sign Language. We hope that that can be scaled up in future years to become a user pay system as well, to encourage more public servants in different areas of government to also become fluent and use NZSL in delivering services. Thinking about use and access, my colleague Kelly mentioned last week the work that is being done to support tangata ture to lead their work and to set their own priorities. They will be responsible for determining what the priorities are for them and to make sure that the work is being led by them. Alongside leading up to a group being established, the board have funded interpreters at treaty commemorations in 2021. They always provide interpreting for the formal celebration, but the board funded interpreting for what we've called social interpreting, but it's what happens on the lower marae, all of that interaction with different groups. We are investigating setting up interpreter standards to understand how to measure or make sure that quality NZSL interpreting is available for deaf people. That work is being done alongside MB at the moment, Ministry of Business, Innovation and Enterprise, or Employment, sorry, not Enterprise. And that there has been considerable time and investment into that piece of work. It is not easy to try and find a system that works for New Zealand, so it is not something that is being rushed. And just last year, the board funded a piece of guidance for government agencies to understand the NZSL Act. What is in the NZSL Act? What are the principles in the Act and how can they implement them in their work? And in particular, the principles of making sure that if there are any matters to do with New Zealand Sign Language, the deaf community are consulted on it, that any information and services are provided in NZSL so that the information and services are accessible for the community. The board supports the NZSL online dictionary. That is a critical piece of work to make sure that the language is documented and therefore can be learnt by any users of NZSL. And the NZSL team itself has just expanded. We now have 4 team members, 3 of whom are deaf NZSL users, and through the team, we believe that we can achieve a lot more of the board's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Shona. I was wondering whether there was anyone from the Ministry of Education who wanted to comment on the aspect of the question around New Zealand children being able to access sign language through the school system. Brian.
I'm not going to speak for the Ministry of Education. I'll let David do that and talk about first signs. I just wanted to add to Shona's really comprehensive description of the work that the NZSL board is doing. And this is because sometimes we take things for granted. The board is constituted to be only NZSL users, and that the majority of those people on the board must be deaf and NZSL users, as well as ensuring that tangata ture are represented on the board as well. So constitutionally, the board meets many of the things that the UNCRPD would expect of us.
Thanks, Brian. Paula speaking. David, was there anything from the Ministry of Education you wished to add?
Thank you, Paula, and
sorry to interrupt, David. It's Paula speaking. We might move on to the next question and just give you an opportunity to address your microphone or speaker system. So if we've got time, we'll come back to you. Otherwise, we may come back and supplementaries on that point. So I'm going to move on to question 7, which will again be asked by Anton Salmons from Deaf Aotearoa. Kia ora, Anton.
Thank you, Paula. Question 7. What concrete efforts, including gathering data and evidence, has the government made, and what are the ongoing measures to A, ensure Māori and Pacific peoples can access information currently and into the future? B, develop and implement a plan to recruit and train in order to increase the numbers of trilingual New Zealand Sign Language interpreters? And C, to ongoing measures to determine what resources will the government provide to ensure rapid scaling up of these measures, and what are the milestones and timeframes in which you will achieve them? Thank you.
Thanks, Anton. Julia.
Kia ora, Paula. Julia speaking. So I'll invite Brian Coffey from the Office for Disability Issues to lead this response with support from Shona Jones again.
Kia ora, Brian speaking. I'll speak in particular to the trilingual interpreters. I think the board recognises that attempts in the past to grow trilingual interpreters through the availability of scholarships at Auckland University of Technology is not achieving what we would want, particularly given 20 years of that, we now still only have one official trilingual interpreter. So the board has thought about this and looked at the NZSL interpreting workforce. There are a number of people within the NZSL interpreter workforce who have growing development in te reo and need the opportunity to grow their te reo skills in order to be trilingual interpreters. That's the path that we would like to take, but consideration needs to be given to how that will be resourced. The other thing that's become really clear is you can't have one process, that in fact those people that might want to take on trilingual interpreting, it will have to be bespoke around their circumstances, their skills and their experiences, rather than actually run a one-size-fits-all course.
It's Paula speaking. Ngā mihi, Brian. Julia.
Just confirming, Brian, so is Shona going to respond to the other parts of that question?
The other parts of the question are not just about tangata ture, I don't think. It's about general access to information in Pasifika languages and Te Reo, alongside of alternate formats. There's work underway through the alternate formats group on that. What does it look like? But still yet to confirm the way ahead on that. Thank you. I'll hand back unless you've got any clarifying questions, Paula.
It's Paula speaking. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Julia. I'm not sure the full question has been answered. We might come back to that in supplementaries if we need to.
Understand, Paula. Thank you. Julia speaking.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move on to question 8. We've got this one and then one further question. So this question will be asked by Nathan Bond from the Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand. Kia ora, Nathan.
Kia ora, Paula. While we acknowledge the Education and Training Act 2020, Section 34, goes some way to recognise the rights of disabled students, it does not go far enough. In short, IMM recommendations appear to have been discounted entirely. The Act retains the term special education needs and lacks measures or recognition of enforcement of the right to inclusive education. What measures will the government urgently take to introduce an enforceable right to inclusive education as a key element of the legislative framework and ensure resource to attain equitable access? Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. It's Paula speaking. Julia.
Kia ora, Paula. Julia speaking. So I'm going to invite Dr. David Wales from the Ministry of Education. Hopefully his sound has been sorted, and David will be supported by Ben O'Meara from the Ministry of Education and Sarah Williams from the Tertiary Education Commission. So over to you, David.
Kia ora tātou katoa. Firstly, can you hear me?
Yes, it's Paula speaking, much better.
Kia ora. Thank you, Paula, and thank you for your question. I'll answer this one. Other people may contribute to the other questions. The right to inclusive education is currently a key element of our legislative framework and is enforceable in a practical sense. Section 33 of the Education and Training Act 2020 sets out the rights of children and young people in New Zealand to enrol, attend and receive education at a state school, including the right to attend for all hours that the school is open. Section 34, referred to in the question, clarifies these rights apply equally to students with learning support needs. Section 127 sets out that a school board's primary objectives include ensuring that their school is inclusive of and caters for students with differing needs. Currently, if a student and their whānau believe that a school's board has failed to meet its legal obligations, they can complain to the Ministry of Education, seek a review by the Ombudsman, or a judicial review in the High Court. The Ministry works with schools to support them to meet their obligations under the Act and has a range of interventions it can use if necessary, including requiring a board to carry out a specific action by a specified date. The Education and Training Act 2020 includes provision for the establishment of dispute resolution panels to provide a more accessible pathway for students and their whānau to resolve serious disputes with schools, including disputes relating to learning support and rights to education under the Act. While the primary focus of the panels would be to resolve disputes through mediation, they would also be able to bring binding decisions and orders with the prior agreement of both parties that would be enforceable through the courts. The implementation of these disputes resolution panels is subject to future budget decisions. We currently consider that once these are implemented, we will have sufficient mechanisms for ensuring that students' rights are upheld without the need to introduce stronger enforcement measures. But we will be evaluating their impact to assess whether any further changes may be needed. Final comment on this, the government spends over $1.1 billion annually on learning support to enable ākonga with disabilities and other support needs to participate in education. Ensuring that there are sufficient resources to support equitable access is an ongoing effort, as the demand for learning support is increasing nationally due to population growth and increasing complexity of needs. Since 2018, the government has invested an additional $1.1 billion over 4 years in learning support and published the Learning Support Action Plan 2019 to 2025 to drive progress towards an inclusive education system. We are continuing to review and strengthen our approaches to supporting students in their local school, including through the Highest Needs Review currently underway. Thank you.
It's Paula speaking. Thank you for that, David. Ben and Sarah, did you have something to add to that? And if you do, can I ask you to please make it very brief because we still have 2 more questions to get through.
No, that's fine, Paula.
Okay. All right, I'm going to, with that in mind, move on to question 9, which is also to be asked by Nathan Bond from the Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand. Thanks, Nathan.
What timeframes and measures, including gathering data and evidence, is the government taking to make sure the New Zealand education system is A, in line with the UN CRPD, General Comment 4, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and inclusive of intersectional group disparities such as disabled Maori and Pacific peoples. B, co-designed with disabled people through their representative organisations, DPOs, in all levels of the education system. C, addressing key education initiatives by setting up a reference group of disabled people through their representative organisations who report directly to the Minister of Education. Thank you.
Kia ora anō. Thank you, Nathan. Oh, sorry, Julie. Are you okay for me to go?
Kia ora, Julia speaking. Yes, with your permission, Paula, I'd invite David, Dr. David Wells from the Ministry of Education to lead this response.
Thanks, David.
Kia ora, thank you, Paula. The government is taking measures across its education work program to give practical effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi and move towards a more genuinely inclusive education system in line with the UN CRPD. This work is guided by Ka Hiketia, the Māori Education Strategy, the Action Plan for Pacific Education, the National Education and Learning Priorities, and the tertiary education strategy. The National Education and Learning Priorities and the TES, Tertiary Education Strategy priorities, include ensuring that places of learning are safe and inclusive and free from racism, discrimination, and bullying, and reducing barriers to education for all, including for Māori and Pacific learners, disabled learners, and those with learning support needs. Education providers are now working with their communities to give effect to the National Education Learning Priorities and the Tertiary Education Strategy priorities. We are developing a monitoring framework to measure system-level progress against the priorities and will be reporting on this in the future. Meeting our obligations under the UN CRPD requires building inclusion into the universal aspects of the education system, including curriculum, teaching methods, and assessment. We are currently refreshing the New Zealand curriculum to ensure that it is truly Te Tiriti honouring and inclusive so that every ākonga can see themselves, be successful in their learning, and be confident in who they are and their abilities, including our disabled ākonga. The curriculum is being refreshed progressively over the next few years, with all schools to be using the fully refreshed curriculum by the end of 2025. We are also developing tools, resources, and supports for teachers to help them shift their curriculum practice in line with the refresh. At the same time, we are redesigning Te Maraotanga o Aotearoa as an Indigenous curriculum based on Te Tamaiti he Raukura. This is a framework which promotes a holistic view of learning and development. It recognises ākonga as members of their whānau, hapu, and iwi, and supports them as carriers of their ancestral legacies through whakapapa. The curriculum work is being progressed in tandem with the NCEA change program, which includes a focus on making NCEA more inclusive by requiring that all achievement standards are accessible by design. A Disability and Learning Support NCEA panel made up of disabled people and school leaders responsible for learning support was set up in 2020 to provide perspectives and feedback on the design and development of new NCEA achievement standards and other projects with the NCEA change package. Recognition of the uniqueness and diverse needs of all learners is also built into the recently released Literacy and Communication and Math Strategy and He Raukura Mō Te Mokopuna, which expand the definition of what it means to be literate, to be inclusive of different ways of communicating. Meeting our obligations under the UN CRPD involves ensuring that disabled people have access to effective, targeted, and individualised supports where needed to enable them to reach their full potential. The government's priorities for learning support are set out in the Learning Support Action Plan 2019 to 2025. A key part of this is the Highest Needs Review, which aims to ensure that children and young people with the highest needs receive the learning supports they need, when they need it, and for as long as they need it. We are currently undertaking engagement and gathering insights through quantitative data analysis and a literature review to inform the development of options. We know that ākonga Māori and their whānau face additional barriers to accessing the supports they need due to the intersectionality between race and disability. Each priority area in the Learning Support Action Plan has a dedicated focus on supporting Māori to achieve success as Māori. For example, kahikatea principles and outcome domains have been embedded into the functions and role responsibilities of learning support coordinators, including a need for learning support coordinators' work to be whānau-centred and respect identity, language and culture. A Learning Support Coordinator Network bicultural platform has provided a focus for professional development on supporting Ākonga Māori and their whānau with a webinar series on Te Ao Māori and learning support. The third phase of the Learning Support Coordinator evaluation will specifically focus on learning support coordinators in Māori medium to identify what changes need to be made in the future to ensure the role can effectively support Ākonga, whānau, kaiako, and tūmauki in Māori medium and kaupapa Māori settings.
David, it's
Nikki.
Paula speaking. I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. I'm just very conscious, and it's not your fault that we have gone over time for this session, and just to ensure that we have time to develop our supplementaries and come back on time for the public at 11. I'm going to ask if we could have the rest of that answer as a written answer. It looks like you've prepared some information which would be really helpful
We can
for
provide
the
it.
IMM. And sorry for those who didn't get to build on that, but you may have that opportunity in the supplementary questions. And we had a question 10 around anti-bullying programs, which we will come back to for a response in the third part of this session. So ngā mihi nui, thank you for your responses so far, and thanks to everybody listening. We're going to take a short break now to develop our supplementary questions, and we will be back at 11 a.m. sharp. So thank you.
Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining the IMM Forum. We are now in the breakout session. Please come back for supplementary questions at 11 a.m. We will begin in 60 seconds.
Ngā mihi nui, kia koutou katoa, ko Paula Tesorero toko ingoa. I'm Paula Tesorero, I'm the Disability Rights Commissioner, and I am chairing the third part of session 7 around accessibility and independence in the IMM Forum on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Welcoming everybody back, including people who are listening. Thank you to all those who submitted questions on Slido. We have done our best to try and include a number of those, as well as questions prepared by the IMM team in the past half hour. We're going to move to asking those questions. Just a couple of points to make before we begin that process. The first is we had some residual matters to carry forward from part 2. One was question 7, which was around broadly access to information. Brian, I'm going to ask if you're comfortable to provide a written response to that instead of providing further information on that today.
Sure, absolutely. And if we can seek more clarity around what the questions are actually getting at, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, we'll do that. And shortly we'll move to one of the questions that we did not get to in our previous session around anti-bullying. I just want to briefly explain the way in which we're going to do these supplementary questions after we take question 10. We're going to run through a series of supplementary questions. At 11:45, we are then going to put the remaining supplementary questions on the table for a written response, simply because we have too many supplementary questions in this session. So without further ado, just a reminder to please say your name and what agency you're from when you respond, and to try and look and be as close to your camera as possible. So I'm going to move to ask question 10 from the pre-prepared questions. I'm going to move to Nathan Bond from the Disabled Persons Assembly of New Zealand. Over to you. Thank you, Nathan.
What is the government doing to implement anti-bullying programs and give redress to disabled children who are affected by bullying in the education system? Thank you.
It's Paula speaking.
Kia ora, Paula, it's Julia speaking. I'll invite Dr. David Wells from the Ministry of Education to respond to that question.
Kia ora, Julia, kia ora, Paula, and kia ora, Nathan. Thank you for the question. Since 2019, the Ministry of Education has continued to work with the cross-agency Bullying Prevention Advisory Group to develop and strengthen resources to help reduce bullying in schools. These resources are made available on the Bullying Free New Zealand website, which provides a range of resources and information, including a guide for school boards, a guide for parents and whānau, and a student voice guide. Bullying Free New Zealand content is underpinned by the evidence-informed Bullying Free New Zealand School Framework, which contains 9 core components for effective whole school bullying prevention and response approaches. In 2021, work began to improve the Bullying Free New Zealand website and resources to ensure the changing needs of key audiences are met. This work will consider the needs and perspectives of disabled learners. In 2020, the Ministry of Education partnered with the Office of the Children's Commissioner to learn from good practice. This project involved hearing from students, staff and whānau at 5 schools, including a Kura Kaupapa Māori school. The experience of disabled children and or those receiving learning support were a focus of this engagement. Findings from this work were shared in the Our Kind of School report, published in November 2021. And the findings will be used to inform the direction of further work to address bullying in Aotearoa. The government continues to provide schools with free access to the online Wellbeing at School survey tools. The survey data helps schools understand the level and type of bullying that might be happening, the extent to which known protective and risk factors are present, and where improvements can be made. Since 2019, all Wellbeing at School survey items have been reviewed and updated with input from the sector. Additionally, new Wellbeing at School survey items regarding fairness and racism and student resilience strategies have been developed and trialled. We are now considering the best way to integrate new items into reporting schools, into the reporting that schools utilise for self-review. The government supports an annual Bullying Free New Zealand Week to raise awareness of the impacts of bullying and effective proactive prevention and response strategies. We are now undertaking work to strengthen the reach and impact of this initiative. Representatives from youth organisations, including those advocating for disabled youth, are being consulted with to help guide this work. The government continues to support an independent organisation called NetSafe to help students stay safe online by providing online safety education, advice and support. NetSafe has dedicated education advisors working alongside schools to develop digital citizenship and provide advice on online safety, including online bullying. It should be noted that an inclusive school culture that values diversity can greatly reduce the risk of disabled students experiencing bullying and support effective redress when it does occur. The government supports schools to strengthen their inclusive practices through a tiered model of support. This includes through resources and guidance, for example, the Inclusive Education Guides, initiatives that support the development of a positive, inclusive school ethos, for example, positive behaviour for learning school-wide and restorative practice, and a range of specialist roles that support schools to tailor supports to meet the needs of all learners and embed inclusive practices. For example, the establishment of learning support coordinator positions, the use of psychologists and resource teachers learning and behaviour. Kia ora.
Ngā mihi, David. Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm going to move straight into our supplementary questions. As I said, Anton will proceed to ask those questions for a response this morning, and then at 11:45 he will put the remainder of the supplementary questions on the table for a written response at a later date. So with that in mind, I now hand over to Anton Simmons from Deaf Aotearoa. Kia ora, Anton.
Great, good morning and thank you, Paula. Question 1. What data and evidence does the government have on disabled learners' school attendance, including being welcomed at their local school? And also, what steps is the government taking to increase and improve data and evidence relating to disabled learners themselves?
Kia ora, Julia speaking. I will invite Dr. David Wales from the Ministry of Education to respond to that question.
There is still work to be done in this space. We don't collect specific data on the disability status of our learners to the extent that we could use it in the way you are asking. It is a space where we are doing work in terms of developing more standardized approaches to what have become known as learning support registers, so that each school has an understanding of the learning support needs of their students. But bear in mind that learning support as a construct goes a little further than the construct of disability, but it incorporates that.
So we expect over time to be able to put in place a reporting mechanism that links material that's in learning support registers to wider system settings, such as attendance, which is often recorded in school management systems. But the timeframes for that are still being worked through. We have a lot of privacy and security issues that are being worked through at the moment with regard to data collections and making sure that everything is robust in student management systems before those processes occur, and that's quite important to avoid any risks associated with the data sets.
Kia ora, Julia speaking, just confirming that was Ben O'Meara speaking from the Ministry of Education. And I'll just invite Brian Coffey from the Office for Disability Issues, who wants to also make a comment.
Kia ora, Brian speaking. In response, Anton, to your question, on the ODI website, there's a couple of proxy measures for disabled children and their positive experiences in education. If you go on the education outcome, for example, it reports the Youth 2019 survey, which disaggregates data by disability, and in terms of positive experience of school, 64.7% disabled children and young represented positive experience compared to 88.8% of non-disabled. So in support of what David and Ben are saying, we've gathered some data that's sitting in data sets in order to, as proxy measures for what you're inquiring about, but there's more to do. One of the proxy measures was the number of schools that disabled children attended versus non-disabled children.
Thanks, everybody. And Anton.
Great, thank you. I'll move on to question 2. Given there are many disabled adults whose experience in the formal education system was compromised by inadequate accommodation of their needs, and that this has left them less able to participate in many aspects of civil society, what programs therefore exist to help these adults obtain the education they need so that they can become full participants in their democracy? B, what efforts are being made to help TWM learn Te Reo Māori so that they can fully participate in iwi, hapu, whānau, and other related events? What efforts are being made to improve print literacy of disabled people? And finally, D, what efforts are being made to increase New Zealand Sign Language skills of deaf people and also their family members? Thank you.
Kia ora, Anton, Julia speaking. So I'll just try and direct those questions in part. So I'll look to Sarah from the Tertiary Education Commission to respond to part A of your question regarding adults' participation.
Ngā mihi, Julia. Thank you. Sarah Williams, Tertiary Education Commission. There are at the moment limited opportunities for disabled people who have left the compulsory schooling system to participate in tertiary education. And this is something that the Commission and the Ministry of Education are very aware of and are looking for solutions. One of the things we are doing is seeking to increase the capability and capacity of the entire tertiary education system to respond confidently and capably for disabled and neurodiverse learners. We have two major initiatives underway in that space. The first is the creation of a large guidance toolkit with supporting resources called the Kia Ora Rite Toolkit. It is a toolkit to increase capability in tertiary education organisations to ensure that they can properly support disabled learners so that disabled learners experience the same education experience and outcomes as all other learners. That toolkit was designed with the input of disabled people, including tangata whaikaha Māori, and focuses strongly on the involvement of those people in the practices. The second thing that's significant in this space is the Tertiary Education Commission, as the funder of all tertiary education post high school, has required that tertiary education organisations that receive over $5 million in funding produce a disability action plan, which they submit to the Tertiary Education Commission. That disability action plan has quite concrete requirements around what is expected, including the involvement of disabled learners, staff and communities in the creation of that plan. And those plans will be monitored and assessed by the Commission as part of the funding that tertiary education organisations receive. Similarly, in that space, we are working with Te Pūkenga, the new National Network of Vocational Education, to look into the provision of the currently quite limited skills for living and skills for working qualifications which are available at tertiary education space, and also the provision of those kind of foundation education bridging programs. At the moment, they are not as available as widely as we would like them to be available. And so we have undertaken working with Te Pūkenga to look at the network availability of these kind of options and see where they can be increased as part of our overall capability building for the sector. Thank you.
Kia ora, Sarah. Julia speaking. So I'll now invite Dr. David Wells from the Ministry of Education to respond to parts B and C, B being about tangata whaikaha Māori in terms of te reo Māori, and C regarding print literacy.
Thank you, Julia, and I may need to draw on my colleague Ben here as well, because I think both of these are areas that are still remain works in progress. We recognise the need to do some further work in this space, and we'll continue to look at what we can be done there. Ben, are you able to shed any further light on those aspects?
So we recognise, as I think do other government agencies, that te reo Māori specialists are very limited in supply in the sorts of services that we provide in learning support. And we have a service that we have been trialling, which enables te reo Māori specialists te reo Māori speakers, fluent speakers who are not specialists, to interface with our own specialist learning support staff. We do have a number of learning support specialists who have actually come from international jurisdictions, so they're migrants to New Zealand, and so we're working through Te Maho, which is the Ministry's new regional function, to integrate the specialist expertise of those speech and language therapists, psychologists and other people with the skills of our fluent te reo Māori speaking staff. So that's our main initiative in that area. We acknowledge that we've got quite a bit of work to do in terms of linking tikanga Māori, te reo Māori skills with the learning support, our learning support delivery model.
Kia ora, Ben and David, Julia speaking. I'll just invite Brian to make a comment and then just check back in regarding part C of that question in terms of print literacy. Brian?
You're on mute, Brian.
You're on mute, Brian.
Sorry, I'll try again. Apologies, Brian speaking. Just again, speaking to data on the ODI website about education, draws on data from the youth survey around attendance rates, self-reported by youth, disabled versus non-disabled, and number of and tertiary qualifications as well. So trying to gather all of that information into one place against the outcomes in the disability strategy.
Julia speaking. Kia ora, Brian. Just checking back in with you, David, regarding point C, or did you want to follow up on that?
I wonder whether that's something that we could include in the table questions. That might be a more effective way of getting some useful information back to the panel.
Thank you, David. Julia speaking. So I'll move on to part D of that question and invite Brian Coffey regarding New Zealand Sign Language.
Kia ora. Could we just repeat that question? I was busy drawing no answers to the other questions.
Sure. What efforts are being made to increase NZSL skills of deaf people and also their family members?
Okay, I think this is one for education to talk to First Signs and what Ko Takareo is doing and sign language in school. From the Sign Language Board, the contribution there is around the funding of family camps for deaf children and their families, recognising that a very low proportion of deaf children are actually born into deaf families. Most deaf children are born into hearing families. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Brian. I'm happy to pick that up. So we have a number of initiatives, all intended to promote and progress New Zealand Sign Language. As Brian mentioned, we have Kotaku Reo, which is the merger of the two former deaf education centres, Van Ash and Kelston, and the range of services that they have both on site and in terms of outreach to support deaf ākonga. One of the services that they provide is New Zealand Sign Language at School, delivered to deaf and hard of hearing ākonga enrolled in their local schools. So that's an aspect of the outreach that occurs through Kotaku Reo. It provides access to NZSL in school through communication education support workers and NZSL interpreters, and supports in-school education workforce through the resource teacher for deaf. An evaluation of NZSL at school in 2021 found that all eligible students are getting support, and we in the ministry are continuing to work with Kotaku Reo on actions that respond to the evaluation findings. I want to mention First Signs, which was co-developed by the ministry and Deaf Aotearoa and began in 2014. This is currently delivered by Deaf Aotearoa. It's an in-home service delivered in New Zealand Sign Language, and it's designed to assist families and whānau with deaf children under 5 years of age to develop language early in the home and start school with age-appropriate language. It develops networks amongst families of deaf children and the wider deaf community. And again, an evaluation of First Signs found some positive results in 2019, concluding that the service is largely working very well and is much needed and valued by the families and advisors. And we can point you to the online findings there. Kia ora.
Thanks everybody for that. Anton, I'll hand back to you to keep running through the supplementary questions, please.
Sure, thank you, Paula. I'm now going to shift to question 13, just for those who need to know. What is the government doing to ensure that disabled people have access to their cultural practice and identities, including disability culture, in an inclusive and an accessible way? Thank you.
Kia ora, Anton. Julia speaking. I'm not sure that we have an official who can answer that question with us today, unless anyone wants to put their hand up. With the permission of the chair, we may have to invite the relevant agency to provide a written response to that.
Paula speaking.
Brian?
Okay.
Sorry, Paula. Brian may have a comment.
Kia ora. Part of the answer to that is the community fund managed by the NZSL board that Shona spoke to earlier, which is around funding deaf spaces and acknowledging deaf culture. I think Shona talked about the work Waikato University in terms of plays and things like that. All of that is about strengthening deaf culture in Aotearoa. So that's part of the answer.
Yes,
I think
thank you for that, Brian.
Yeah, I think the other part of the answer is the recognition under the UN Convention that in fact deaf children and children with blind and low vision should have access to schooling hubs where they can actually learn culture as well as amongst each other, and then and the development of sign language. So there's exceptions in the convention that New Zealand has maintained in terms of the work of Blind and Low Vision Education New Zealand and through Ko Takareo.
Paula speaking. Thanks, Brian. Anton.
Thank you, Paula. Another question from Slido, from one of our watchers today. I apologize, actually. This is one of our supplementary questions. Question number 6. Parents of adult-aged disabled children experience many barriers when ensuring their child's rights are actually met under the convention, UNCRPD. Who in government, therefore, is responsible for responding to and addressing these barriers? And what is the government doing to ensure that adults with multiple and complex disabilities are able to live more independently with their rights, will, and preferences met in meaningful ways? Thank you.
Kia ora, Julia speaking. I might just first give the opportunity to Erin Black from the Ministry of Health if she wants to comment on that question regarding the Enabling Good Lives, and then I'm happy to provide a response from an accessibility legislation perspective.
Ngā mihi. Thanks, Julia. Erin Black here. Aroha mai, could I just ask for a repeat of that question, please?
Yeah, sure. Parents of adult-aged disabled children experience many barriers when ensuring that their child's rights are met under the UNCRPD, the convention. So who in government is responsible for responding to and addressing these barriers? And what is the government doing to ensure that adults with multiple and complex disabilities are able to live more independently with their rights, their will and preferences met in meaningful ways? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think unable to really do it justice, if I may suggest that we come back and respond to that more formally. I'd like to make some queries so that I can make sure that I'm providing the most correct information to respond to that.
Julia speaking, kia ora, Erin. I can add, although I can't speak to specific examples, I can say that the purpose of the proposed accessibility board is to ensure they engage widely and identify current barriers, including those of which you're referring to, and that board will develop a process of identification of barriers and prioritization of barriers, including then working with the relevant experts, rights holders, and those who have experience of that barrier to develop a response. I can't talk in any more detail regarding the design of that board, as that's currently before Cabinet, but I would say that that is where the responsibility will sit in terms of looking at those more systemic cross-government accessibility barriers. Kia ora. Sorry, I also see Brian has his hand up, who might want to add a comment.
Yeah, kia ora, Julia, sorry for popping up so often. So I would just refer to Mahi Araha, the Carers Strategy Action Plan 2019 to 2023. MSD is the steward of that plan alongside of families in the Carers Alliance. So that's part of the response to the question in terms of what's required for family and whānau who are caring and supporting adults with complex needs.
Thanks, Julia, Brian, and Erin. Back to you, Anton.
Thanks, Paula. Talking about access, I'm going to go to question 14. The new legislation focuses on the Accessibility Governance Board doing a lot of work. Disabled people know the list of systemic access barriers is long and possibly growing longer. Has any assessment of the volume of work required to remove systemic accessibility barriers been undertaken, and, for example, compared to, say, the workload of the NZSL board currently? Thank you.
Kia ora, Julia speaking. Just absolutely acknowledge that there's already really strong awareness of a number of accessibility barriers and how many accessibility barriers exist that will need to be addressed. So what I will say is we know this will be a big job. We know that what that means is that this board and the mechanisms to engage widely will need to be properly resourced to be able to do such a big job. But no, we haven't undertaken that work yet to understand in detail the scale of that, and particularly in regards to your question about the comparison with the New Zealand Sign Language Board. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Julia, thank you. Anton.
Thanks, Paula. I'm now going to question 10. What is the government doing to incentivise the construction of accessible housing in both the private and public housing sectors so that all disabled people have access to an adequate standard of living?
Kia ora, Julia speaking. I do understand that Kāinga Ora did respond earlier in the week regarding their target of 18% universal design housing. We don't have anywhere today who can respond any further to that. We are happy to follow up. However, I would invite Max from the Ministry of Health to provide a comment that's just more specifically related to the health aspects of that question.
Kia ora, Max Reid, toka ingoa. The Ministry is in conversation with Kāinga Ora at a very early stage at this point, but is looking at the possibility of adopting a website similar to that's being used in Australia, housinghub.org.au, which is a free website that enables housing providers, be they public housing, social housing, private providers, to list accessible properties. The disabled community is able to access that website, indicating the kind of house that they are looking to either buy or rent, the living arrangements, whether they wish to live with on their own or with another disabled person or with a non-disabled person, what their support needs are, what their geographical preferences are, and those filters will then provide them with a list of suitably accessible accommodation to meet their needs. That has been quite a significant transition for the disability community in Australia, and as I say, we're looking at the possibility of working with Kāinga Ora to see if something similar can be established in New Zealand. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Max. Thank you.
Kia ora, Paula. Julia speaking. Sorry, I just need to correct myself. I understand the Kāinga Ora target was 19%.
15.
Oh, it was 15. Okay, sorry, my apologies.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
Kia ora, Paula. Can I just put out a challenge? I saw correspondence to the Minister recently from a disabled person who is advocating for Trade Me and other real estate sites to do a filter on accessibility. And that might be something that civil society might want to lobby on.
Thanks, Brian. Paula speaking. Thanks for that. Anton, back to you.
Thank you, Paula. We're moving to question 15 now. When disabled people talk about minimum acceptable standards, they mean standards with a lowercase s. The response from government seems to focus on official standards with a capital S. From the experiences of official standards like NZS 4121, the IMM independent monitoring mechanism is already conscious that the process of creating an official standard is slow and that these standards require ongoing maintenance. So will the new legislation empower the Accessibility Governance Board to make express minimum access standards by way of statements, declarations, or determinations?
Kia ora, Julia speaking. I'm sorry I'm not able to respond to detailed questions at this time about the design of the proposed accessibility board, as those aspects are currently before ministers for under active consideration. Of course, they will undertake, once this work is public, to share that information.
Paula speaking. Okay, thank you, Julia. Anton.
Thank you, Paula. And thank you for your explanation there, Julia. We'll move to question 16 now. In the response to question 2, it was number 2, it was stated that the accessibility framework is yet to be created. So when will the accessibility framework be developed and made available to the public?
Kia ora, Julia speaking. The first part of that is the legislation, and that's obviously the substantial part as well, and the legislation is planned to be introduced in July 2022, so this year.
Paula speaking. Thanks, Julia. Anton.
Thank you. I'm going to move back to question 9 now. In 2018, the UNCRPD committee raised the issue of the multiple and intersectional discrimination faced by disabled migrants in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So how does the government intend to eliminate disabled migrants' experiences of multiple and also intersectional discrimination? Thank you.
Kia ora, Julia speaking. I'm just going to look for a little bit of help, probably from my colleague Brian, as I'm not sure that we have anyone who could respond to that question. Sorry, Anton. Brian?
Kia ora, Julia. Although you're my boss, I can't help you on this one. I think we'll have to come back with a written response.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. My apologies.
That's all right.
Thanks, Julia. Oh, sorry, Anton. Sorry, you go.
Sorry. Where are we? Right, a similar question, and perhaps the response will therefore be similar, but for question 21, what are the government's plans to improve attitudes and awareness towards accessibility?
Kia ora, Julia speaking again. As I think you referenced earlier, part of the framework for accessibility is legislation, education and awareness. So those are the 3 core parts of that framework. And again, I unfortunately don't have the detail on that. A lot of that work hasn't yet been done, but that is a core part of that framework.
Thanks, Julia. Back to you, Anton.
Thank you. Question 5. The IMM recognises the government's substantial effort and commitment towards ensuring information is produced in the 5 alternative formats, so Easy Read, NZSL, Braille, audio and large print. However, we also know that there are people in our community who have additional and specific informational needs. So what is the government doing to assess and address the unmet informational needs of disabled people, including tangata whaikaha Māori, me whānau haua, and tangata Sa'i Limalo?
Kia ora, Anton, Julia speaking. I'll look to Brian to provide a response to that question. Thank you, Brian.
Kia ora, Julia. Kia ora, Anton. There's work to be done on that in terms of the alternate formats. That's absolutely acknowledged. So I can come back for some detail from Anne Hawker, and Anne Hawker unfortunately wasn't available for today's session. She will be able to provide some written detail on the work that's been done to progress that issue.
Thanks, Brian. Anton, and just letting you know that we've got 1/4 of an hour to run.
Great. I'm going to go to question 7. And it would be good to get a response to this before we move on to some of the other questions. It's common for disabled adults to live with aging parents and caregivers. So how is the government ensuring that there are a range of accommodation options, supports and services for disabled adults that are in line with the EGL principles, given A, the disabled person may want to move out of home, or B, the disabled person needs to move out due to the death of a parent or some change in their circumstances?
Kia ora, Anton, Julia speaking. I will invite Erin Black from the Ministry of Health to respond to that question.
Kia ora, Julia. I'll call Anton, Erin Black here. So still in its early phases, but what I can offer is a project that the System Transformation Program is currently scoping, formerly called Aging Well. This project will be aimed or tasked with helping parents who are aging and or thinking about succession planning for their loved ones. So aspects of future care, housing, also estate management will come into scope of that. Again, it is very early days, so we're still firming up the scope of that project, though I can see, particularly in the context of other questions that have been answered today, that there is certainly a need for something of this sort. So look forward to providing future updates as that progresses. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Erin. Back to you, Anton, for the rest, which I think you're going to put on the table for a written response.
Thank you, Paula. Yes. We're going to give you the remaining questions, and I'm going to start with question 3. In 2021, Waka Kotahi consulted with the Disabled People's Organisations Coalition and others on the requirements for urban buses in New Zealand, or the RUB. And during the engagement, Waka Kotahi was asked to provide some details on when guideline requirements would become a reality across the public transport fleet. However, given these are only guidelines, some public transport providers have failed to implement informational disability requirements, such as audio announcement, captioning, picture-in-picture. So when will the government introduce enforceable accessibility standards within public transport across the Motu? Thank you. Then I move on to question 4. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, many disabled people, including tāngata whakaha Māori, me whānau haua, and tāngata Sa'ilima law, do not have access to technology or the internet. So how will the proposed Access for New Zealanders legislation address digital disadvantage and also exclusion? I'm now going to move on to the Slido questions, starting with number 8. What government actions are being implemented to ensure that disabled people living in residential services, including care recipients under the Intellectual Disability Compulsory Care and Rehabilitation Act, IDCTR, can enjoy the full benefits of enabling good lives, EGL? What is the government doing to apologies for just apologies, just a miscommunication there. We're doing question 12 now. Many disabled people face barriers when they're accessing supports they need to found a family. So from reproductive health to support when they become parents. How is the government ensuring that disabled people, including people with learning disabilities, can access their right to found a family? One of our other Slido questions we'd like answered is question 17. What assurances will there be for disabled people to ensure that the new broadcasting entity will be accessible, providing all content with audio description and captioning on all platforms? And how will any new accessibility standards actually be monitored? Question 18. What assurances can the independent monitoring mechanism have that the panels named by the Ministry of Education are meeting and are making progress? Question 19. What is being done to support care workers and foster families learning NZSL to better support deaf children in their care? Question 20, what is being done to scale up NZSL support and resources for deaf children? Question 21, what are government's plans to improve attitudes and awareness towards accessibility? Question 22, what is being done to improve accessibility of public transport and infrastructure? Question 23, what is being done to encourage deaf and or disabled people to train, be employers or employed within the Enabling Good Lives system transformation? Question 24, what is being done to extend NZSL interpreter courses and training throughout Aotearoa? Currently, the only course is in Auckland, a 3-year program. And then the last of our questions from Slido. Hard of hearing, both younger and older people and whānau have to pay to attend NZSL classes. Is anything going to be done to help us learn the language faster and without cost barriers? And that takes us to the end of our list of questions. Thank you.
It's Paula speaking. Ngā mihi, Anton. Can I just check you did questions 11 and 17? You're on mute, Alan.
Apologies, I'll take Anton back. That's okay, Alan, says Anton. Question 11. What is the government doing to ensure disabled children in state care can access the same standard and quality of health and disability support as their disabled peers who are not in care? That was question 11. And then I'll just go down to question 17. What assurances will there be for disabled people to ensure that the new broadcasting entity will be accessible, providing all content with audio description and captioning on all of the platforms? And how will any new accessibility standards actually be monitored? Thank you.
Thanks, Anton. That brings us to the end of our session this morning. Before I hand over to Mātua Hemi to close us out in the appropriate way, I just want to say thank you on behalf of the IMM to government officials today for responding to the earlier, more formal questions and then also the supplementary questions. Brian has all of the supplementary questions from all 4 days of the IMM forum, and so we'll be working out a process with him to get responses to the questions that we've asked, including the ones today that we didn't quite get to. So thank you very much, everybody, for all of the preparation work and effort that you put into preparing for and responding to the IMM's questions today. And thank you to everybody listening who sent through questions on Slido. As you can see, we managed to get to some, but not all of them for a response today, but they will be responded to in writing at a later date. So ngā mihi nui, kia koutou katoa. Thank you, everybody. And I will hand over to you, Mātua Hemi. Kia ora.
O tēnā koutou katoa. Nei rā te mihi aroha ki a koutou e whai wāhi mai ki roto ki tēnei wānanga o tātou. E pāna ki te āheitanga me te mana motu hake mō ngā tāngata whaikaha, me ngā whānau whaikaha Māori. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou, kua uru mai ki tēnei wānanga. A me ngā kōrero matapaki o te wā. Ahoi anō, me pehera ana mihi ki a tātou ki kore e mutu. Tēnā kōtau, tēnā kōtau, tēnā kōtau katoa. He wāhi kara ki a whakamutu tēnei. Kia tau te rangi maari e ki rungi a tātou katoa. Ruia, 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 ruia ki runga, ruia ki raro. Ruia ki roto, ruia ki waho. Ruia ki uta, ruia ki tai. Hu ana ki te rangi, turu ana ki nuku nā, kua tau, kua mau, kua ea, tihe wā, mauri ora. Kia ora tātou.